Hi everyone, my name is Miguel Vega and I'll be presenting on enumerating NetBIOS for attack escalation. There's a lot of protocols used on network systems which can be taken advantage of and exploited very easily if administrators don't take the necessary precautions to secure or disable them. In this presentation, I'll be exploring the NetBIOS service, which is a service that allows Windows systems to share files, folders, and printers on machines across a local area network. This service is particularly responsible for the network discovery option that allows you to see, anyone within your network or any other resources that are available to you. NetBIOS can be extremely useful in determining various types of system information such as user IDs, as well as any open file shares. This service also allows access to systems in varying degrees based on the configuration or misconfiguration that is present. So NetBIOS actually stands for the Network Basic Input-Output System. It's a service, like I mentioned before, that allows you to browse resources or other systems on the network, and it does so by making use of the SMB or Server Message Block Protocol. Most of you should remember this protocol as being the one that was actually targeted by the WannaCry ransomware malware that spread last year. Specifically, it was the actual spreading that took place using the SMB vulnerability, which allowed it to traverse the network and infect other hosts using that very same network discovery protocol that we mentioned earlier. So PCs on a NetBIOS local area network communicate either by establishing a session or by using NetBIOS datagrams or broadcast methods. Sessions allow for a larger message to be sent and handle error detection and correction as well. This communication is on a one-to-one basis. Datagram and broadcast methods, on the other hand, allow one computer to communicate with several other computers at the same time, but are limited in message size. There's also no error detection or correction used with datagrams or broadcast methods. However, datagram communication allows for communication without having to establish a session. And NetBIOS, connection-oriented and connectionless communications are both supported, so both TCP and UDP protocols are allowed. It also supports broadcasts and multicasting and supports 3 distinct services, which are naming, session, and datagram. So the most common command used with NetBIOS is simply nbt stat. This command produces output about specific target, which helps in further enumerating systems on a network. Here we can see the actual command is very simple to execute. It's simply nbt stat -a, and then you put the victim IP or host name. The output looks similar to what I have here, though this is not complete output. The rest of it is on the next slide. There's something important here that needs to be looked at, which is the third row, master-home, with a type of 20 unique. Using this table of the NBT stat output, the 20 identifier is actually there to inform us that this particular host has file shares enabled and that the system is vulnerable to attack by NetBIOS. Having this information in mind, we can then move on to see what's actually available on the host so that we can use the netview command actually to see that information. This sample output shows us a list of shares that are available to be looked at on the given host. To explore them, we can simply browse them by using the netuse command and mapping a share to our machine. From this point, you can explore the files on the share and attach the other shares to see what is available on them as well. So at the very bottom there, we have the example net share command, which is net share, and then you give it a drive letter, and then you give it the actual network share to be mapped to it. So upon executing this command, we will be mapping the share1 share for the 192.168.100.100 PC to our K drive, which we will then be able to access at will. So now I'm going to get into a variety of tools that can actually be used to leverage some of NetBIOS's functionality. These tools kind of extend the capabilities that the default NetBIOS commands kind of leave out. The first of which is going to be the NetBIOS auditing tool. This tool is designed to explore the NetBIOS file sharing services offered by the target system. It implements a stepwise approach to gather information and attempt to obtain file system level access as though it were a legitimate local client. NetBIOS auditing tool, also called NAT, also explores administrative shares and attempts to access resources through use of common user IDs and passwords that can either be entered on the command line or included in text files. This means that by inputting a user list and a password list, you can essentially attempt to brute force these network shares using this particular tool. Here's actually sample output of when you actually run the command. The important parts of this output is when you see the message able to access share, which basically means that the share is accessible with the user ID and password combination that was mentioned at the top of the scan. In this case, it would be administrator and password, which unsurprisingly is still one of the top username and password combinations of services like this when an administrator just forgets to configure it and leaves the default credentials in place. This particular information is valuable for getting even more elevated access to a system via NetBIOS rather than just accessing open system shares like we were doing before. The administrative shares allow us to get valuable information such as SAM or security account manager information from the system. This leads to more in-depth attacks directly on the system, which I'll cover later on. Another useful tool called WinFo is a simple enumeration tool for NetBIOS. It displays any information available by establishment of a null session. In the case that null sessions are not allowed on the target system, WinFo will use any currently established sessions. So as I previously mentioned, you can use the netuse command to map a network share and actually establish the session to a known vulnerable host, which WinFo can then use to actually execute its commands. This is a sample output generated by a successful issuance of the WinFo command, which returns any user accounts and shares on the vulnerable system. So here it lists out the user accounts administrator and guest, which are two default accounts on most Windows-based machines. It also lists out administrative level shares such as IPC and the C drive. Perhaps the most beneficial tool overall, though, is one called WinFingerprint. It is an administrative network resource scanner that allows you to scan machines on your local area network, and it returns various details about each host, including NetBIOS shares, disk information, services, users, groups, and a lot more. By using WinFingerprint to enumerate the NetBIOS information, it's actually possible to obtain the SID for a user as well. Here we have an example of output produced by WinFingerprint. It lists all the shares similar to some of the other tools that I covered, but as you can see on the second line, it also includes a user SID, which is basically the ID that that the Windows operating system uses to associate a user within that OS. By obtaining this user SID, we can then make use of two tools where we can query the security account manager of the local or remote machine to take a known item, which in this case would be our SID, and convert it to an unknown item, which would be the username. So in essence, we can take the user ID that we were able to obtain and get an actual user account present on the system to then target. The SID is made up of the following parts, which start with the letter S, which is the SID identifier. The next value is the revision number, followed by the identifier authority value, which in this case is 5. And then there's 4 sub-authority values, and finally a relative identifier, or RID. The RID is actually not included in the SID that we received from WinFingerprint, so we can use some common RIDs to try and determine available user IDs on the target system. However, before we use these SID tools, we need to ensure that we have a null session established to the IPC admin share using the netuse command. So like I previously mentioned, we can just do netuse, give it a drive letter, and then give it this IPC admin share, so we can establish a session on it and then use these tools on it. Once we see that the command actually is successful, we can now run the sid2user utility and see what results we get by running it against our victim system, which is again 192.168.100.100. The information that we obtain with these tools is valuable since it gives us a user account which we can then attempt to brute force or crack on the file system, so we can actually get a hold on a live system within the network, and then we can either attempt to do privilege escalation, or we can move laterally to a more valuable machine, and from that point forward we can continue our attack. So essentially this presentation covered the potential vulnerabilities that are faced by making use of NetBIOS and having unsecured file shares on the machine, using a variety of tools that I covered and vulnerabilities within the NetBIOS service. We're able to successfully obtain user SIDs, which can then be used to identify users within the machine. At this point, an attack could be launched against those user accounts in order to gain system access and continue the attack. So it's very important to disable any administrative shares that aren't used, and to secure those that are, since they could potentially reveal sensitive information about the system, which could help an attacker gain a foothold within the network. So ultimately, this concludes my presentation on enumerating NetBIOS and the potential problems that could arise from its use within the network. Thank you all for your time.